Josip Broz was born on May 7, 1892, in Kumrovec, which is a small village near the border between Croatia and Slovenia, then under the rule of the dual monarchy. The region that he lived in, Hrvatsko Zagorje, was the site of peasant rebellions in the 16th century. This revolt had such an impact that it created a local folk tradition of putting feathers in caps. In 1903, the peasants of this region would once more rise up against increased taxes. The seed of rebellion was planted in Broz's mind at a young age. It would eventually germinate in the proper conditions. And trust me, the conditions were proper. Broz was of peasant origin and grew up in extreme poverty. He was the seventh child of 16 children, all of whom did not make it to adulthood. The home of his father, Franjo Broz, which only having 2 rooms and was already barely enough to care for the family as it was, housed not just Broz's already large immediate family, but also members of his extended family. Broz did not even have shoes growing up, and this was true of many southern Slavs in those times when agrarian poverty reigned supreme. This poverty thus influenced young Broz, like so many other poor peasants and proletarians in those days, to join the workforce so that they could provide for their families. Because of Broz's environment, because he needed to work, he was never able to complete school and only ever attended 4 years. Broz's first job outside of working in family farms was at an inn in Sushak. Later, he'd be working as an apprentice for a local Czech locksmith. It was while working at this apprenticeship that Broz first came across socialist politics. His fellow workers at the shop decorated it for May Day, and they also encouraged him to read and sell the social democratic newspaper, Slobodna Reč, Free Speech. Broz was described as restless by his schoolmaster, and his biographer, Pirjevec, agrees. Broz had been traveling around Croatia in search of work, to no avail. Eventually he would leave the area and began working various jobs at factories and shops in Austria, Bohemia, and Germany. Along his travels, Broz became a skilled metalworker and also became a capable speaker of German and could also speak some Czech. These would be important language skills that would serve him well in the future. At a young age, it seemed that Broz had a desire to travel, and he also wanted to immigrate to America, a place where many Slavs had and would continue to immigrate to. However, he only made it as far as to the port city of Trieste, where he was saved by a local branch of the Social Democrats, which organized shelters for the less fortunate. After this venture failed, Broz would return to Zagreb, and he joined a trade union as well as the Union of Socialist Youth. In this city, he would be a part of his first strike and demonstration as well. In 1913, at the age of 21, Broz was drafted into the army, and he soon became a petty officer. When the war broke out the next year, he was sent firstly to the Serbian front during the initial invasion of the Austrians. When Russia soon declared war in response and attacked the dual monarchy that same year, Broz was sent off to the Carpathians to defend against the Russian invasion. But before he was sent off eastwards, however, he spent some time in prison for either participating in anti-war propaganda or for threatening to defect. Tito has given multiple accounts of this story, so take that as you will. But at the time, Broz, initially, despite his socialist tendencies, was not particularly a defeatist or a pacifist. At first, he was just another soldier in the army, doing what they were told was their national duty. In the future, Tito would hide this part of his past so as not to offend the many Serbs that he was leading over. Still, in performing his national duty, Broz would become a prisoner of war when his unit was ambushed in the early months of 1915. After being badly wounded in battle, he was taken to a military hospital deep inside the Russian Empire. He spent about a year in this hospital, where he managed to learn Russian by reading Russian classics gifted to him by the nurses. After Broz recovered, he was sent to a POW camp near the Shira River in March of 1916. Here, Broz refused an offer to join a Serbian-led battalion, where he would be made to return to the front but on the Russian side, and instead, he began to work for a rich peasant on a flour mill. In the fall, he was taken away once more to the Urals, where he was made to work on the railways as an interpreter. When Broz was at this camp, he was beaten by the camp guards for complaining about Red Cross parcels being stolen. Broz would be put in prison after this encounter, but this prison was broken into by a crowd of Russians after the February Revolution erupted, and as a result he was returned to his camp. Later, he would meet a Polish Bolshevik who helped him find a job on the railways, and then helped him reach Petrograd by foot in the summer of 1917. In the city of the Revolution, Broz found work at a factory, and was himself actually a part of the July Days demonstrations against the provisional government. When the police began firing on the crowd, Broz would escape, and he found himself in Finland, but he was arrested and sent back to Petrograd. Back in Russia, local police identified him as an escaped POW, and he was put on a train to be sent back to the Urals. On the way back to prison, Broz took a drastic decision. He decided to jump from the train he was on and make yet another escape. During the confusion caused by the revolution, Broz managed to board another train without anyone really bothering to care. In the situation of political breakdown caused by the revolution, no one was really pressed about who was doing what, and thus Broz was able to slip around the country with ease. The train Broz would end up on took him to Omsk in far east of Russia. The train was stopped by local Bolsheviks in November, or rather October, when the revolution to overthrow the provisional government was taking place. He was recruited and joined the Red Guards, where he worked as a mechanic and guarded the railway. In 1918, Broz applied for both Communist Party membership and to be a Soviet citizen, but he was denied both because there was no Yugoslav section yet. The Bolsheviks in Omsk would be overthrown by the Czechoslovak Legion, and Kolchak's White Army would move in and turn the city into their base in May of 1918. Broz only narrowly escaped certain death at this point by the Czech legionnaires by taking up refuge in a Kyrgyz village, the locals of which protected him from those who searched for any Bolsheviks who may have escaped from Omsk. In November 1919, the Red Army would finally drive Kolchak's forces out of Omsk and force them on a retreat to the east. From here, Broz returned to Petrograd once more with his new wife, Pelagia, where he then learned that Austria-Hungary ceased to exist and that his home of Croatia had been incorporated into the newly founded Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. Broz would return to his home with his wife and a group of other war prisoners. He was briefly detained, but eventually allowed back into the country. Now back in Croatia, Swain writes on Tito's trajectory. In this political climate, Tito struggled to find work. In Zagreb, he was briefly a waiter, taking part in a successful waiters' strike, and then worked as a locksmith. When in November 1920, the Zagreb trade unions organized a meeting to mark the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, Tito was asked to speak and ended his oration with the slogan, "The workers can only conquer with the help of arms." Tito also actively campaigned for the communists during the elections held to the Constituent Assembly in November, but this got him sacked, and employment for a known communist became even harder to find. At the beginning of 1921, Tito and Pelagia moved to the village of Veliko Čvojstvo near Bjelvar, where Tito found steady work as the mechanic in charge of a mill. He worked here for 4.5 years until the middle of 1925. It would be in 1923 that Broz, after being contacted by a fellow communist who was seeking to reorganize the KPJ, which had been disrupted by the 1921 crackdown, that Broz would re-enter active party work and take up leadership positions. In 1924, he was in charge of the party's Krzyzewski district committee, as well as being elected to the local trade union committee. It was around this time that Broz would catch police attention and would subsequently be put under police surveillance. In 1925, Broz gave the funeral oration for a fallen comrade, at which he would give a rousing statement that he swore to fight for communism to the end of his life. He then whipped out and began to wave a red flag. For this demonstration, he was arrested and sent to prison, but only for about 8 days. But because of this little stunt, Broz was now being watched by the police even further. But at the same time, he also began to make a name for himself in the party. Swain writes, "In the summer of 1925, Tito's employer died, and the nephew who took over the business did not appreciate Tito's political activities. He was now under regular police surveillance, and his room was regularly searched. So Tito and his family moved to Kraljevica, a small coastal shipbuilding town, where he worked on the 21st of September. Tito brought with him some 50 books, including The Iron Heel by Jack London, Woman in Socialism by August Bebel, and Mother by Maxim Gorky, and soon an informal workers' library had been established. Elected shop steward, Tito was soon organizing a Communist Party cell, and then a successful strike to get compensation for wages, which by then were 7 weeks in arrears. During this dispute, Tito contacted the General Council of the Metal Workers Union in Belgrade, asking it to intervene, and thereafter his name was known in the trade union circles in both Zagreb and Belgrade. When, after a year in Kraljevo, he was involved in another strike, he was made redundant on the 2nd of October 1926. He was then called to Belgrade by the Metal Workers Union, enticed by the offer of a good job. On moving to Belgrade, he found work at the Smederevska Palanka Railway carriage factory, some 40 miles outside the capital. Tito was elected a workers' trustee and took the opportunity to study at the workers' library attached to the Metal Workers Union headquarters. He was also encouraged to write an article for its newspaper, The Organized Worker. Sacked as a result of this article, Tito returned to Zagreb in March 1927. By April, he had a new job and was again organizing a trade union branch, but When the campaign was over and recognition had been obtained from the employers, Tito left industrial employment and became what he would be for the rest of his life, a full-time labor movement organizer, first secretary of the Metal Workers Union for Zagreb, and then secretary of the Croatian Regional Committee. Broz's party work, when he did become more active, was not unhampered, even though he was not in the high ranks of the party leadership. The factional fights were actively disrupting party work and making any sort of organizational activity almost impossible. In 1926, when Broz tried to join the local party cell in Belgrade, he was rejected by the leftist faction because he was critical of their insistence on their factional disputes. It was because of this that Broz took up his anti-factional fight in 1928. Pirjevec quotes Broz saying that this fighting reached such dimensions that the honest communists were prevented from joining the party organizations. The leaders were interested only in retaining their positions and the Comintern's financial aid. Actually, it was more than that, as it involved a regular monthly salary, much higher than the salary of ranking state bureaucrats. This too compelled me to enter the fight against the factions. Out of the skirmishes between Sima Markovic's right faction and Rajko Ivanich's left faction, Broz, Andrija Hebrang, and the anti-factional Zagreb line prevailed at the 8th Zagreb City Conference. Even though Tito took a non-factional approach, he was certainly on the left of the party, and dutifully followed the new Comintern line, which was confrontational during the third period. Broz would become secretary of the city committee in Zagreb in place of Andrija Hebrang due to his proletarian background, and as a result, Broz would gain recognition from the Comintern, who praised his initiative, but also, at the same time as his ascendancy in the party, he was taken from 2 stars to 3, and now the police were looking at him even further. The police had already caught Broz, or Georgievich as they knew him in 1927, but during Broz's case, he was allowed to go free pending an appeal to his charges. But when the police went to go pick him up and send him to prison, he was nowhere to be found. The police would finally catch him again in 1928 on May Day when he was organizing a demonstration by the KPJ to disrupt Social Democrats at the Apollo Cinema. In that year alone, Broz would have gotten arrested 3 times, and by that point he had been involved in at least 7 run-ins with the police. But somehow they still didn't know a great deal about him. It was his arrest in August 1928 that was perhaps his most precarious. After being tipped off, the police searched his quote-unquote illegal apartment. In his apartment, the police found an unlicensed Browning revolver and several bombs that were under a stash of Marxist literature. In custody, the police tried to beat a confession out of Broz so that he might incriminate a comrade, but he remained steadfast, tight-lipped, and instead went on a hunger strike. A letter of his, where he complained about his treatment in jail, was published in the Comintern magazine, International Press Correspondence, as a cry from the hell of Yugoslav prisons. When Broz was taken to trial in November, he was not very cooperative. In fact, he took a quite militant stance. He pleaded that he was not guilty. He stated that he did not recognize the court because it was bourgeois, and that the only institution that he was responsible to was to the Communist Party. He argued at his trial that the weapons weren't his, but that they were planted. He shouted, loud and proud, "Long live the Communist Party! Long live the World Revolution!" And during his final speech, he was interrupted several times and was eventually just dragged away by the police, during which he was still shouting communist slogans. It was at this moment that Broz became more widely known in the party and by the Comintern. In the KPJ's illegal newspaper, one intellectual, August Cesarec, would write in the aftermath of Broz's showing in court, "If this young and morbidly ambitious communist becomes leader of the CPY, it will be a disaster." Broz, who we will now call Tito, would be put in prison for the next 5 years. During his time in prison, he switched around various prisons around the country, and he was also forced to serve those 5 months of prison that he absconded from. While in prison, he would meet and befriend a Jewish intellectual named Moshe Piede. He helped Piede translate Capital from German into Serbo-Croat, and formed a study circle with him where they read Marxist classics like Luxemburg, Plekhanov, and Kautsky. He also read Engels' Anti-Daring to a circle of his comrades in the prison. According to Pirjevec, Tito's prison stint likely saved his life. He writes, on January 6, 1929, only a few days after he was sentenced, King Alexander dissolved Parliament, abolished the constitution, and created a dictatorial regime under the premiership of General Petar Zizkovic, one of his henchmen. The king and the prime minister were of the opinion that Yugoslavia should be governed with an iron fist, without any pretense of parliamentary democracy. They acted accordingly, abolished all political parties, and declaring war on all forces of the opposition, Albanians in Kosovo, Macedonian separatists, Croat nationalists, both moderates and extremists, and naturally, communists. During the years 1929 to 1931, the enemies of the regime were arrested in mass. Some 100 members of the CPY, the most staunch and pugnacious, were tortured to death in the terrible Glavinjaša in Belgrade or in other police stations scattered throughout the country, while the prisons of Lepoglava, Mitrovica, Maribor, Zenica, Niš, Požarevac, and Skopje bulged with their comrades, sentenced to prison terms with varying degrees of severity. Those who managed to survive the interrogations, or not simply shot in the back by the policemen during an attempt at escape, were lucky, since, at least behind the bars, they were comparatively safe. When Tito was released from prison in 1934, the state of not just the party, but the world had changed drastically. Milan Gorkić from the Comintern was now the party leader, and perhaps because of Tito's notoriety, he had placed Tito into his inner circle. Tito would travel to Vienna illegally, where he joined up with the KPJ leadership. However, at this time, the Nazis were attempting to overthrow the regime of the Catholic fascist Engelbert Dollfuss, who was jokingly referred to as Millimeternik for his short stature. The situation in Yugoslavia was not much better, as Tito reported that the communists at home had lost faith in the Central Committee. At the party's fourth conference in Ljubljana in August of 1934, Tito was elected to the KPJ Central Committee. However, at this point, the cart was definitely put before the horse, because he had been brought on the Politburo way before then. Still, this was the moment that Tito finally attained a really high position in the party. At this point, Tito was 42 years old. Gorkić, on the other hand, was only 30, yet he was Tito's boss. Gorkić would send Tito back to Yugoslavia, where Tito would engage in party work and enacted whatever orders he was given by Gorkić. In fact, Gorkić would send Tito around on missions quite often, and Tito felt that Gorkić was actively trying to keep him away from the party in Vienna, and that he was purposely putting him in danger by giving him these underground missions so soon after he got out of prison. Later in life, Tito would even say that Gorkić's hair and his mustache were the reddest parts about him. In 1935, following King Alexander's assassination in Paris by one of Ante Pavlovich's Ustasha terrorists, Tito made his way to Moscow, finally returning to the Soviet Union after 15 years. Here, Tito would be housed in the Hotel Lux, a name which definitely betrays its conditions in 1935. In this hotel, where many other Comintern agents were placed, Tito was tasked with writing a personal biography, as well as ones on all of his comrades. During this time, he would also meet a Bulgarian communist named Ivan Karaivanov, a man who would be key to his rise to power in the future. Karaivanov and Vladimir Chopic both certified that Tito was trustworthy, and, as a result, he was placed onto the Balkan department of the Comintern, chaired by the high-ranking German KPD member, Wilhelm Pieck. Here, he received his Comintern codename, and henceforth, for the Soviets, Broz Tito would now be known as Comrade Walter Friedrich. In Moscow, Tito took up new activities. Pirjevec writes, "Although Broz did not excel in Marxist theory, he was considered a faithful communist and one of the few Yugoslavs capable of practical work. In spite of his lack of education, Broz, now known as Walter, was occasionally called to lecture at the Yugoslav section of the International Leninist School, Međunarodnaya Leninskaya Škola, and at the Communist University for the Ethnic Minorities of the West, KUNMZ. His experience at Lepoglava and in other prisons led him to believe that the CPY would be unable to overcome the crises that plagued it unless it succeeded in eliminating its internal struggles. But the situation he found in the Yugoslav colony in Moscow, which numbered over 900 persons, was similar to the one at home. As he later said, he tried to avoid the comrades as much as possible, in part because he loved solitude, to which he had grown accustomed while behind bars, in part because he soon realized that in Moscow, silence was golden, especially in the rooms with a telephone. It was taken for granted that the telephones were bugged, so the less said, the better. He completely dedicated himself to his work, attending courses in management and conspiracy techniques, as well as the famous Frenza Military Academy. In Moscow, Tito kept his head low and minded his own business. He was present at the 7th Congress of the Comintern, where he caught a glimpse of Stalin for the first time. In 1935 also, Tito went on a tour of the eastern provinces of the Soviet Union to see the collective factories and farms that had been erected in the 15 years since he had last been there. According to Tito, at least after he broke with the Soviets, he was not impressed. Whatever Tito's alleged reservations were, he was committed to the cause, so he felt that he must ignore them and push forward with the movement. By this point, Tito had years of experience behind him. He was the definition of a professional revolutionary. He had picked up several languages during his travels and during his time in prison. He had accrued dozens of pseudonyms and fake identities. Tito was like a walking mystery. His own language he spoke with a foreign accent to the surprise of others. He seemed to not even be real. During the partisan war, neither the Germans nor the British knew who he was, just that the elusive, unknown communist Tito was wreaking havoc in the Balkans. In the future even, when he broke with the Soviets, they would allege that the real Josip Broz died in 1915, and in fact a, quote, Jewish bourgeois stole his identity. The Americans would take this further, and in the 80s, the NSA, after conducting studies on Tito's speech pattern, concluded that he was not a Southern Slav, but he was actually a Russian or a Pole. When the Spanish Civil War erupted, Tito's new job was to enlist Yugoslav volunteers to go and fight for the Republic. Tito by this point was also becoming increasingly critical of Gorkić due to his mistakes as a party leader, and he was particularly critical of his handling of the Popular Front tactic and the KPJ's underground cells. As a result of an open dispute between the two, the Comintern stepped in and made Tito the KPJ's organizational secretary in Yugoslavia and retained Gorkić as the political secretary abroad. Tito would return to Vienna from Moscow in October 1936, and his new mission was to transfer the party headquarters from Vienna to Paris. In Paris, there was a large Yugoslav immigrant community. Thus, from there, he would continue his work on recruiting and dispatching Yugoslav volunteers to Spain. It would be in 1937, after doing some more work for Gorkić, that he would finally end up in Paris. But in the summer of that year, Gorkić was suddenly summoned to Moscow, and when Gorkić left for the USSR, he, quote, disappeared into the mist, as Tito put it. In Gorkić's absence, two Politburo members, Rodoljub Čolaković and Sretan Žujović, proposed that Tito become the party's interim leader. From this point on, during the KPJ power struggle, Tito would rise from being the party's de facto leader to its de jure leader, and in time, he would eventually become the leader of Yugoslavia after World War II. Tito's rise within the party will be the subject of our next video.